When a story you've followed for almost a decade finally ends, why do you so often feel, well, not closure, but this weird sense of confusion?
It's that paradox of the big finale, isn't it?
Yes.
You, the audience, you spent years investing, theorizing. You basically become a co-writer in your own head.
Right. And when the official ending doesn't match your version, it creates this friction, this feeling of unevenness.
And that exact feeling is why we're doing this. We're launching a deep dive into the source material, all that fan and critic commentary around the Stranger Things finale.
Our mission is pretty laser focused today. We need to figure out why it left so many people feeling either totally underwhelmed or, on the flip side, completely satisfied.
And we're going to do that by dissecting the biggest narrative choices, the character endings, and you have to talk about the plot holes that the sources just cannot let go of.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this fandom documents everything. And the central tension we found in all that commentary really boils down to two huge issues.
First, was the finale just too predictable, too safe? Did it lack the high stakes that were promised?
And second, and this is the big one, did the writers fundamentally change the nature of the main villain, the Mind Flayer and Vecna, right at the end of the game?
That villain dilemma is really where we have to start. It seems to be the source of the deepest frustration for so many viewers.
Yeah, that identity crisis for the show's biggest threat, it became a massive sticking point.
When you look back, especially at seasons 2 and 3, the Mind Flayer was this enormous, terrifying, almost abstract presence.
The word everyone uses is Lovecraftian.
Exactly, cosmic horror. It's about these entities that are just so vast, so incomprehensible that they defy physics and sanity. And it was visualized perfectly as that particle cloud, that shadow monster looming behind the gate.
That was its strength. The terror was in the fact that you couldn't fully understand it. It was unknowable.
Right, so you can imagine the disappointment, which is all over the source material, when its final form isn't some abstract cloud, but a massive physical spider-like creature.
The critiques on the aesthetics were just brutal.
Oh, they were. It was dismissed as a generic video game enemy.
Yeah.
I think the exact phrases were an Elden Ring boss or just, a giant spider.
And that shift from this particle cloud to a physical monster, it just ruined the design for a huge part of the audience.
Yeah.
They wanted an interdimensional singularity, and they got a big bug.
And it wasn't just about looks. That visual change created this huge contradiction in the lore they'd already built.
How so?
Well, the Mind Flayer was always shown as shadow particles, right? As exotic matter.
Yeah.
It operated by possessing things, controlling them.
Okay.
But when it certainly gets this physical body, its actual power, its durability, seemed to go down, not up.
Right. The sources are full of this. It was supposed to be this interdimensional god-level entity that commanded an army.
And the final fight was, 10 minutes long?
If that. There's this widespread feeling that the creature had the durability of an 85-year-old man. It was taken out with fire and spears.
After all that buildup, it just felt like a quick skirmish. It completely lacked that cosmic dread we were promised.
And that lack of dread leads directly into the next big confusion, the hierarchy. Who was actually in charge here? Was it the Mind Flayer or was it Henry Creel, Vecna?
That's the question that really seemed to muddy the lore for everyone. Was Henry the puppet master, or was he the puppet? Or were they, partners?
The narrative seemed to suggest at first that the Mind Flayer was the one pulling the strings, right? That it was using Henry as its general.
Yes, and the external lore, like the first Shadow stage play that a lot of sources mention, apparently backs this up. It showed the Mind Flayer constantly getting into Henry's mind, manipulating him.
So the classic stare into the abyss and the abyss stares back trope. Henry was ultimately just a tool for this ancient evil.
That was one interpretation. But then you have dialogue from the show itself that suggests something more complicated.
The "it never controlled me and I never controlled it" line.
Exactly. That implies a symbiosis, a partnership, and other more sophisticated takes compared it to the Ner'zhul Arthas King scenario from video game lore.
For anyone who doesn't know that, what does it mean?
It's basically when a human host merges with or takes control of a much more powerful, darker entity and becomes the dominant consciousness. So in that version, Henry actually took over the Mind Flayer.
But that ambiguity, whether it was intentional or not, it just left people confused. It felt like a confusing quasi-retcon.
And a lot of viewers just reject the idea that a human consciousness could control an eldritch god. It kind of deflates the original threat. If Vecna is stronger than the Flayer, why were we so scared of the Flayer for 3 seasons?
And speaking of the Flayer's power, where was its army? The Demogorgons, the Demodogs, all of it. Where did they go during the final battle?
That was a huge point of frustration. The complete absence of its legions just felt like a massive, glaring plot hole.
It's what made the whole fight feel way too easy. It just lacked the scale we'd been led to expect.
The fan theories trying to explain it are honestly more interesting than what we saw on screen.
I saw 3 main ones floating around.
Right. Theory 1 is the internal consistency argument. It suggests that all the Demogorgons and Demodogs were merged together to create that giant spider body.
So similar to how it used humans in Season 3, but with creatures instead. The army became the monster.
That's the idea.
But if that were true, wouldn't it have looked different? More chaotic, like that human monster, not just a clean spider design. It feels like a stretch.
It does. It's a convenient after-the-fact explanation. Then you have Theory 2, which is the Dungeons & Dragons theory.
Which is?
That Will's developing powers were acting as a direct counter to the hive mind, so the creatures were essentially neutralized. They weren't effective anymore.
So that relies on Will having these powerful unseen abilities in the finale.
It does. And then there's Theory 3, which is the most pragmatic and honestly the most cynical.
That it was just bad writing.
Basically. That the army was left out because it was easier to write a quick 10-minute fight. It points to immense plot armor for the heroes and just prioritizing a quick emotional beat over logic.
So no matter how you slice it, the big bad villain was left without any security guards, which just makes the whole thing feel less threatening.
Exactly. But before we leave the villain, there's one fascinating symbolic detail that the sources picked up on. And it says a lot about the writer's priorities.
The number 12.
The number 12. The spider creature has 12 legs. And sources immediately connected that to the 12 children Henry needed for his plan.
It's a very clean narrative symmetry. 12 apostles, 12 months, a D&D party size. It's a number that signifies completeness.
Precisely. But that focus on symbolism highlights another critique. The sources kept asking why Vecna even needed 12 children. What was his motivation?
Especially since we saw him open a gate on his own to get Will back in Season 1.
Exactly. If he was already that powerful, why this convoluted plan with 12 specific victims? It feels like the number was chosen for its theme and the actual plot mechanics were just ignored.
Style over substance, which is always a letdown in a finale.
And that feeling of a letdown carries right over into the character arcs.
Yeah, if we accept that the big cosmic fight was over in 10 minutes, it feeds directly into that huge criticism about the heroes having crippling plot armor.
The expectation for major deaths was sky high. I mean, you had Steve, Nancy, Robin. They all had these incredibly close calls in the past.
So the idea that everyone survives the final world-ending battle just felt... well, it felt unearned.
It diminished the threat. The show was accused of abandoning its horror roots to become an action flick with indestructible plot armor.
If the world is on the line, you expect loss. Without it, the victory feels a bit hollow.
And the choices about who did die were also sharply criticized. Kali, for instance. She was introduced late. A lot of people felt her story was clumsy.
And so her death just didn't have the impact. The sources basically said nobody cared for her death in the context of the main group's survival.
The consensus was pretty clear. To really raise the stakes, they needed to kill a core character.
Someone like Murray, or even Karen Wheeler, a death that would have genuinely shocked the audience and motivated the heroes.
Without that, it feels like they were playing it safe, keeping all their options open for spin-offs.
And that feeling of playing it safe extends right to the main protagonist, Eleven. Her arc was widely seen as being sidelined for most of the season.
Yes, and her final moments were seen as really contradictory. Her plan to sacrifice herself
Was seen as lame because she had just told Hopper off for trying to do the exact same thing. It felt like a regression for her character.
And then the ending just puts her right back where she started. The girl, alone, hiding in the woods. It makes all her years of growth feel like they went nowhere.
Which brings us to the big debate. Did she even survive? Or was that ending just Mike's way of coping with her death?
This is where we get the Kali illusion theory. It's probably the most detailed sand theory to come out of the finale.
It's the idea that Eleven did survive, but her appearance at the end and her supposed death was all an illusion created by Kali, a big strategic escape.
It completely reframes the ending from a tragedy into a piece of tactical genius.
Okay, so what's the evidence for this? Because that's a pretty big leap.
There are two major inconsistencies in the finale that support it. The first is the sonic weapon problem.
Right. 11 is somehow telepathically talking to Mike while they're right next to these military sonic weapons that are designed to dampen her powers.
And she couldn't overcome them before. But now, she does it. And she doesn't even cover her ears, which is the one thing we've seen her and Kali do to block the noise.
So the physics just conveniently change for her in the most important moment.
She wasn't actually there. The theory is that she was somewhere safe and isolated, and Kali was projecting her image and her voice into the battlefield.
That's a huge mental hoop to jump through, but it does explain the inconsistency.
It does. And the second piece of evidence is Kali's own death.
Which was also very ambiguous.
Extremely. She's shot, she's at the center of this huge explosion, and then she just disappears. The theory suggests her death was another illusion, part of the plan to let 11 escape in the chaos.
So the moment Hopper went for the med kit was the window they used to execute the plan.
If you accept the theory, it's not a tragic sacrifice. It's a brilliant collaboration between the two surviving subjects.
And it connects back to those little visual clues, like the waterfalls Mike sees in his vision of her being alive.
Exactly. Mike imagined 3 waterfalls, but the place she's shown in has 2 or 5, depending on the source. It's not his perfect vision, it's a real place. It grounds the theory in a tangible reality.
Okay, let's talk about Will Byers. His development was almost universally called mishandled.
He was just the sad boy for so long. And while the finale tried to give him focus, it felt rushed.
People pointed to his coming out scene as feeling awkward and out of place, like it was forced in for reasons outside the main plot.
And it distracted from what should have been his core story, his connection to the hive mind.
Which leads to another huge lore issue. If he's so connected to Vecna and the Mind Flayer, why was he just fine when they were being destroyed?
Right. He should have been in agony. He should have felt something, but he was just fine. It made his final confrontation with Vecna feel rushed and kind of empty.
It completely undermines his importance to the whole mythology.
And finally, let's talk about the pacing. That epilogue, it was so long.
Oh, the Return of the King effect, where the movie ends 3 or 4 times. Some sources said the final 30 to 50 minutes were all epilogue.
And while some people liked the sweet emotional beats, others found it excessive, even cringe.
But the real problem was the 18-month time jump. It just skipped over so many crucial things.
The military plotline is the most glaring. The group killed nearly 100 soldiers, and then nothing. The plot just disappears.
No deal, no interrogation, no consequences. It's a complete evasion of accountability.
And what happened to Dr. Owens? He was last seen chained up. He knows everything. And we never see him again.
It just strains credibility. And the time jump created other logical messes, too.
Like Max being in a coma for over a year, but somehow graduating with her class. It shows a complete disregard for time and consequences, just to get a neat, happy ending.
Which brings us to the bigger structural complaints, where consistency just sort of fell by the wayside.
And the biggest one, the one that is maybe the most frustrating, is how much the show started relying on external material to explain its own story.
The first Shadow stage play.
Yes. The critiques are full of this. It has Henry Creel's entire backstory, even little details about the town.
And the frustration is that you shouldn't have to go see a play or buy a book to understand the motivations of the main villain in the TV show you're watching.
It feels like locking essential context behind a paywall. It makes the show feel incomplete on its own.
And then there are the physics of the Upside Down itself, or Dimension X, or the Abyss, whatever it's called now.
So many questions. Like, how was the atmosphere breathable for humans? This is the place that transformed Henry into Vecna, but our heroes can just walk around in it.
It doesn't track, and that ties into the water inconsistency, which, dedicated fans really got into.
They did. The Upside Down was always shown as being dry, right? Lakes dried up. But then 11 uses a giant water-filled sensory deprivation tank there. The technical explanation in the sources is that the vacuum of the dimension only destroyed natural water, but a sealed manufactured tank could survive.
Wait, really? That feels like they invented a physics loophole on the spot just to make that one scene work.
It does feel like a retcon, doesn't it? It wasn't established before. It feels like convenient plot engineering.
You also have to talk about the weapons. The damage was all over the place.
Yeah, the nerfing critique. It's at the core of the plot armor argument.
Right. So the military's machine guns couldn't hurt demodogs, but Nancy's machine gun can suddenly damage the giant Mind Flayer.
And Vecna himself can tank bullets from soldiers, but he's taken down by a couple of road flares and some spears from a group of teenagers.
It's just so inconsistent. It really feels like the rules of physics just changed depending on who is holding the weapon. The villain was made weaker just to make sure the heroes got the kill shot.
And finally, in this section, we had the problem of the disappearing characters. All these fates just left hanging.
Dr. Owens is the biggest one. He's a loose end with critical information, and his fate is just unknown. It undercuts the idea of a clean ending.
And then the smaller relationship threads that were just dropped during the time jump.
Like Robin's girlfriend, Vicky. They break up off screen. We don't get any resolution.
And her friend Susie is barely even mentioned after being so important in other seasons. It feels like the writers just rushed through all the personal stuff.
And what about Holly Wheeler? She was built up to have some significance. Maybe she was another number.
And then her final appearance is a quick D&D scene. It's another tantalizing thread that just gets clipped and thrown away.
All these omissions, they create this feeling that the story isn't really over, which contradicts the entire point of a finale.
But despite all of that, all the plot holes and inconsistencies, the ending did offer one potential type of closure that really resonated with some people.
The D&D metaphor.
Exactly. That final shot of the Dungeons & Dragons manual led to this very popular storyteller theory.
The idea that the entire series was just a D&D campaign being run by Mike.
Yes. And in that framework, everything makes a certain kind of sense. Vecna, the oaths, the military plot holes. It's all just the dungeon master's orchestration.
The fluctuating physics are just Mike changing the rules of the game on the fly to make the story better.
It gives you an intellectual way out. It reframes the entire epic as a symbolic end to their childhood.
And it also changes how you see Eleven's ambiguous ending.
Completely. Mike's belief that she's alive hiding in Iceland, that's his personal closure. It's how his character moves on from the grief and trauma.
So the ambiguity becomes the point. The show is telling you to believe what you want.
If you want the tragic sacrifice, she's dead. If you want the happy ending, she escaped with Cully's help. It's a choose-your-own-adventure ending.
But that leads to the more cynical debate. Was that safe ending a creative choice, a nod to hopeful 80s movies? Or was it just a business decision?
And a lot of critics came down hard on the business decision side.
The fact that no major core characters died was seen as a move by Netflix to keep the door open for spin-offs and sequels.
You keep your huge international stars alive. You can bring them back for another project. The sources flat out say they'll bring them back for a new season. And that commercial thinking really undermines the artistic risk.
And it stands in such sharp contrast to the ending a lot of viewers felt they deserved.
The 11 Reclamation arcs.
Yes. This alternative ending that was so popular in the commentary, it rejects the idea of her just passively hiding away.
Instead, it would have been this powerful arc where she actively goes on the offensive. She hunts down every last lab, every person connected to Dr. K, and destroys the program for good.
She takes her power back. Instead of being the hunted, she becomes the hunter.
It's the difference between a sweet, sentimental ending and a truly cathartic one, where the systemic evil that started everything is actually dismantled by its greatest victim.
For a lot of people, that was the only way to really earn the closure they were looking for.
So to wrap up our deep dive here, we've unpacked that shifting identity of the Mind Flayer, which just fractured the threat. We've talked about the plot armor that sacrificed the stakes.
And we wrestled with the ambiguity around Eleven's fate and the a total disappearance of the military plotline after that huge time jump.
And I think it's fair to say that while the finale really struggled with its own lore and narrative consistency, its strength was in hitting those emotional notes.
Friendship, growing up, overcoming the odds.
It absolutely nailed the hopeful optimism of the 80s movie tradition it was always channeling, even if it had to break its own rules to get there.
And that 80s hope is probably what allows the ambiguity to work for some people, but given all the loose threads we talked about.
The Mind Flayer particle's still out there, Dr. Owen's still captive, the military plotline just abandoned.
And the show's own history of fake deaths. If we accept that the finale was Mike's story, his way of processing grief and hope, what's the one detail he left out or maybe exaggerated? That guarantees 11 is still out there.
The one thing that proves the adventure never really ended, and that the real threat is still waiting. That's the question that keeps the book open long after you think you've closed it. A heroic sacrifice followed by a happy ending is the stuff of fairy tales, right? It's the perfect Hollywood bow wrapped up neatly with a triumphant ribbon. But what if that joyous epilogue we saw, that peaceful, snowy landscape, wasn't a victory of magic at all, but the ultimate calculated illusion?
That is the monumental uncertainty the creators left us with. We're diving deep into the final moments of the series finale, where the ambiguity of Eleven's survival splits the entire audience right down the middle.
Yeah, it really does.
It forces us to choose between two profoundly different emotional truths.
So our mission today is laser-focused. We're taking the mix of expert source material, the logistical breakdowns, the production interviews, all the passionate fan theories, to meticulously analyze the ultimate question.
Did she make it out?
Exactly. Did Eleven truly survive through a strategic, meticulously cast illusion from her sister Kali, allowing her to escape?
Or, and this is the heartbreaking one, was that beautiful, quiet epilogue merely a fictional narrative woven by Mike, the aspiring writer, struggling to cope with devastating, undeniable loss?
It's an ending designed to be divisive. It asks us to confront the reality of grief against the power of belief.
It does, and we really need to look at the hard evidence in the sources to see which theory holds up under scrutiny, even if it means sacrificing the narrative closure we all hoped for.
Okay, let's unpack this uncertainty. Let's start with the theory that holds the most hope, but, it arguably requires the biggest suspension of disbelief.
Theory 1. The calculated illusion.
Right. This theory says that Eleven's apparent death or disappearance was a necessary deception, primarily engineered by Kali. Number 8, allowing Elle to escape the military and the cycle of conflict that has defined her entire existence.
And if we're going to start there, we have to immediately confront the biggest logistical hurdle this theory faces.
The psychic blockers.
The psychic blockers.
Ah, yes, the sonic frequency dampeners. The sources all call them her kryptonite. Mm-hmm. The military activated these right near the gate, specifically to neutralize Eleven's powers, to make her completely vulnerable the second she got close.
And this is the crucial point. The source commentary is very, very clear on this. The minute she was near or passed through the gate, those sonic blockers were on, and they were pointed directly at the entry point.
So they were designed to suppress any high-level psychic activity within a specific radius. But here is the major power anomaly that keeps the alive theory afloat. If those blockers were active and Eleven was walking towards the gate, either sacrificing herself or being captured, how did she manage to pull Mike into her mind space for that emotional final farewell speech? Even if it was just for a few seconds, it shows she still had some residual functional power.
That's the key power paradox we have to wrestle with. If she was truly walking into the primary field of those sonic dampeners, any use of her powers should have been instantly suppressed.
Instantly.
Yet she managed to connect with Mike's mind space, even if the connection was, fuzzy and brief.
And proponents of the illusion theory, they just seize on this. Since she could use her powers to connect, they argue she must have been physically outside the blocker's immediate effective range.
So she was maybe already out of the military vehicle.
Exactly. Which supports the idea of a pre-planned escape or some kind of illusionary camouflage that masked her actual location.
Right. If she was already safe, the power exertion might have been minimal, like a quick psychic text message, if you will not, requiring the maximum strain that would be instantly neutralized by the blockers. It suggests she was already hidden.
That makes sense.
And we also see that the message was cut off right after she started to ask Max what junk food she wanted. She was still lucid, still capable of formulating complex thoughts and initiating contact, which implies physical distance from the main suppression field.
Wait, okay, but if the illusion theory relies on her being hidden after exiting the military vehicle, that implies an incredibly narrow window of opportunity for Kali, doesn't it?
Oh, massive.
How did she just disappear from the military's grasp without being noticed by every soldier, especially Dr. K, who was actively supervising the whole thing?
This is where Kali's Gambit, the ultimate sisterly intervention, is required to fill a massive logistical gap. The theory completely relies on Kali, the sister with the illusion powers, setting up this ultimate camouflage.
And this plan requires an unbelievable level of coordination and, frankly, survival on Kali's part.
It really does. Let's break down the logistics of Kali. She was supposedly shot in the stomach by a soldier who was aiming higher.
Right.
The theory insists she faked that injury, or at least survived it long enough to fool Hopper and the crew into thinking she was defeated and, move on.
That would allow her to operate in secret, away from the core group.
That faked death was critical. By convincing the group she was out of the fight, she gained the necessary cover to execute the plan for Elle later. But the timing problem is astronomical, like you said.
Astronomical is the right word. Kali was near the epicenter of that exotic matter explosion that essentially caused a spatial collapse, destroying the entire upside-down laboratory structure.
And for anyone just listening, let's simplify that a little. The exotic matter explosion wasn't just like a big bang. It was a localized event that tore holes in reality and literally destroyed matter.
So for anyone to survive that at close range, let alone be lucid enough to cast a complex pinpoint illusion, demands an extreme leap of faith.
Absolutely. The theory argues she either held on just long enough or was far enough away from the initial destructive shockwave of that spatial collapse to project the perfect pinpoint illusion right as Elle walked toward the gate and escaped the military truck.
So she'd have to be lucid and active despite a potentially fatal gunshot wound and an imminent implosion or explosion.
I mean, it stretches the boundaries of their established universe, even for a character who has powers.
It really does. It demands that Kali performed a near miracle of timing and projection while bleeding out. So what evidence do the pro-survival theorists cite, beyond that power anomaly, to make this demanding scenario believable?
It comes down to emotion, or, more accurately, the lack of emotion.
The missing sisterly grief.
Exactly. One source points out that Kali, being Eleven's psychic sister, who had a profound emotional impact on her, would absolutely warrant a visible flashback or a powerful emotional reaction from Elle during the finale's final emotional montages.
And we don't get one. We see Elle flashback to Mike, to Hopper, to the good times, even to Max, but we see nothing of Kali. Not a thing.
And the absence of Kali in those crucial emotional montages is cited as evidence that she wasn't actually dead. Or, if she was, that the writers made a huge thematic oversight by making her death completely irrelevant to Elle's final arc.
So if she's alive, the lack of grief makes perfect sense. She's just safe and hidden.
Yeah, that makes the most sense from a pure narrative standpoint, because just ignoring the death of a major number like her would be a severe thematic misstep. It makes the alive explanation much more palatable.
Okay, so let's get to what many people cite as the strongest visual clue supporting the illusion theory.
The missing nosebleed.
The missing nosebleed.
Eish.
This is a fantastic point, and it's cited by multiple sources as a potential smoking gun. We know the rules of this universe. 11, using her powerful telekinesis, especially reaching into Mike's mind space over what could be a large distance, always caused the iconic nosebleed.
It was the physical indicator of maximum strain. It was the cost of her power.
And when she connects with Mike for that final message,
No blood.
no blood, its absence suggests either, one, she wasn't truly using her powers in the traditional strain sense, or two, the scene itself was a projection or some kind of constructed moment not bound by the physical laws of her powers.
Which would confirm the illusion.
Right.
And this is where we have to connect it back to Kali's specific power set. If Kali used her own illusionary powers to facilitate Elle stepping into Mike's mind, it would be an illusion of communication, not an organic psychic link requiring Elle's physical exertion.
So it'd be Kali just projecting the memory of Elle's voice and image into Mike's head.
Exactly. Which could mean Elle is dead or captured or simply physically unable to communicate herself.
That distinction is so crucial. An organic psychic link versus a Kali-facilitated illusion of a link. But, okay, if the creators wanted maximum ambiguity, why include this extremely expensive production detail that almost decisively tips the scales toward Elle being alive and well?
You're talking about the location filming.
I am. The expensive decision to film Eleven's new isolated location in real Iceland, specifically that dramatic landscape surrounding the Hyphos waterfall, is cited as incredibly strong evidence of directorial intent.
The pragmatic argument really wins out here.
It has to. If the intent was to leave her fate entirely ambiguous or confined solely to Mike's tortured imagination, they would have just done a small, cheap green screen set. Or just cut the scene entirely after Mike hears the fuzzy feedback.
But they didn't. They spent millions of dollars on location scouting, on permits, and filming in a recognizable, real-world location like Hyphos, a waterfall we can confirm exists, with 2 specific drops.
That strongly suggests the production intended the character to be actually alive and actually physically present in that specific place.
It's the visual anchoring of reality into what could have been a fantasy ending.
So Theory 1 gives us a heroic, magic-laden escape, cemented by production costs and the absence of a nosebleed.
But it relies on astronomical logistical miracles involving a severely injured Kali surviving a spatial collapse.
Right, so now let's flip the coin and confront the tragic yet, I think, emotionally powerful interpretation.
This is Theory 2, Mike's fictional story. This theory interprets that ambiguous ending not as a narrative gap, but as a deliberate emotional device.
And it's all about Mike.
All about Mike. the dungeon master and aspiring writer using storytelling, his strongest power, to cope with the trauma of losing 11.
The narrative really does set this up from the start of the epilogue. The overall ending so powerfully symbolizes the definitive closure of the main character's childhood, emphasized by that powerful scene of the boys labeling and shelving their Dungeons & Dragons books.
That move is so weighty. They are putting away their roles as heroes, they are shelving the campaigns, and they're embracing adult life. The fantasy world is literally being boxed up.
So if the Upside Down was the ultimate D&D campaign,
then the epilogue is the post-campaign debrief designed by the Dungeon Master himself.
And this is visually confirmed just moments later. We zoom in on Mike's desk, and it explicitly shows the photo of 11 right next to the desk where he is actively writing a book.
It just screams confirmation that he turned their true, terrifying adventures into fictionalized stories to make them manageable.
It provides immense support for the idea that the happy ending epilogue Elle's survival, her new life in Iceland, is Mike's way of finishing their shared D&D campaign.
He's transforming a tragic, real-life ending into the heroic one that the party deserves. He's writing his way out of his grief.
And Mike gives us metatextual permission for this interpretation. He's essentially talking directly to the listener, to the audience.
When he says, you choose what to believe.
Exactly. He literally tells the audience, you choose what to believe, framing the entire happy ending as an interpretation, which validates the whole fictional narrative theory.
So if the creators leave the choice to the audience, the character who controls the narrative within the story, Mike, becomes the mechanism for delivering that choice.
That phrase is just a license for ambiguity.
It allows the writers to have their cake, give the audience a satisfying visual, and eat it too, by maintaining the tragic, emotional reality of the sacrifice.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, because the devil is in the details. We have to analyze the subtle but powerful discrepancy regarding the waterfalls.
Yes. This is core evidence for this theory. Mike had previously told 11 they would escape to a fantastical, perfect place with 3 waterfalls.
3 waterfalls, a perfect fantasy refuge. But 11's actual final location in Iceland, the real-world Hyphos, featured only 2 waterfalls. This detail is seen as critical evidence distinguishing Mike's idealized fantasy from the harsher reality he has to confront. Mike's over-the-top, optimistic imagination, the fantasy of the 3 waterfalls, is subtly but definitively contradicted by the actual reality he writes for her.
The 2 waterfalls.
The 2 waterfalls. The contrast implies Mike is subconsciously accepting a less-than-perfect ending, even in his own constructed narrative.
So he told a fantasy, but the visual reality he imagines for her is slightly diminished. It suggests she is truly in a real, isolated, and maybe even lonely hiding place. The perfection is missing because the reality of the loss is still there.
That's dark. It reframes the entire happy ending as Mike being the ultimate unreliable narrator. He gives himself a functional ending, but it's one that's still tinged with isolation and imperfection, reflecting his underlying grief.
But we have to look at the powerful counterargument, which uses the same 2 waterfalls.
Go on.
Some argue the 2 waterfalls signal a real place chosen by Elle herself, precisely to contradict Mike's overly optimistic fantasy. It proved she is alive and made her own choice to live on her own terms outside of his D&D world.
So she chose reality over his fantasy.
She chose reality.
A fascinating thematic inversion. It either proves Mike can't even imagine perfection because he's grieving, or it proves Elle's alive and actively rejecting the role Mike tries to assign her.
Yeah.
But let's look at the isolation argument, which I think heavily favors the she's gone perspective.
Oh.
Or at the very least, the she's abandoned them perspective.
For critics of the alive theory, 11's disappearance and subsequent isolation, even if it was her choice, fundamentally negates her entire character arc.
Her entire journey was about moving from being a lab rat to finding a found family, to defining what home meant.
Right. And the core undisputed theme of the entire show is that trauma is survived through community.
So Mike's belief in her survival, or the reality of her being alive and hiding, forces her back into isolation. It stagnates her progress. The sources argue this validates the burden myth, the idea that if you are powerful or dangerous, you must abandon your loved ones to protect them.
Which is a fundamentally tragic message for a show that's all about friendship.
It is. And if she is truly alive and chooses permanent isolation, it means years of growth moving from a girl in a cage to a girl with a home, were effectively for nothing.
She's back where she started, alone in the wilderness, even if that wilderness is beautiful Iceland.
This leads us directly to the analysis of Mike's emotional response in the epilogue. His distress and his anxiety, which, they border on PTSD symptoms, are highlighted. He is visibly distraught. He can't settle into the happy ending.
And if he had absolute certain knowledge that 11 was alive and safe, even if she was distant, his prolonged emotional state and the implied breakup due to distance would make no narrative sense.
No.
If your partner is safe, you worry, you miss them, but you don't look like the world has ended.
His continued anxiety suggests he is relying solely on his self-created, fictional coping mechanism for comfort.
Which means he doesn't know she's safe. He only believes she could be. He chose the happy ending because the alternative was unbearable.
Hopper even delivers a line to Mike that feels like a direct nudge to the audience. He says he can find something that allows him to move on or be miserable forever.
And Mike chose the former.
The self-created fiction of her survival. It's a powerful, poignant interpretation, trading certainty for emotional comfort.
The personal stakes are just immense, but we can't fully unpack this ending without looking at the creative context, the ambiguities the writers built into the surrounding lore, which might explain why they just punted the ending to audience interpretation.
Okay, let's move into part 3, connecting the plot threads and the role of ambiguity and context.
The Duffer Brothers intentionally created this ambiguity. They forced the audience to decide if the ending leans toward classic 80s movie heroism or tragic modern realism. But the ambiguity didn't start with Elle's fate. It was woven throughout the core lore itself, which led to a lot of frustrations among dedicated fans.
Case in point, the stage play context.
Yes.
Many viewers were profoundly confused about Henry Creel's backstory, his connection to the number of children he killed, and the true origin of the Mind Flayer's power.
All information that was only fully clarified in the non-televised first Shadow stage play.
And this reliance on external media to fill in core lore gaps is a major source of audience frustration, as the critique noted. The play clarified Henry Creel's early life and even touched on elements like Brenner's Project Rainbow,
which was based on real-life fringe science concepts about space and time travel.
But those deep foundational questions, like why the Mind Flayer wasn't powerful enough on its own, or why Henry needed exactly 12 kids, or the history of the exotic matter stone, were just glossed over in the finale itself.
When the answers to the Mind Flayer's origins or the intricate details of Dr. Brenner's ethically questionable research group are relegated to supplemental interviews or plays, it suggests the finale had to rely heavily on intentional ambiguity.
The old leave it up to the viewer's interpretation approach.
Right. It feels like they were using it to wrap up major character arcs quickly rather than solidifying complex plot points within the show's actual runtime.
It feels like the creative team simply ran out of time or space to properly explain the metaphysical rules of the Upside Down and Vecna's power.
Which makes the ambiguity about 11 feel less like a thematic choice and more like a necessity for closure.
And that leads directly to the massive, nagging plot hole that, for me, really supports the 11 is dead theory.
The military's retreat.
Yes. The gang Hopper, Joyce, the kids, they killed many, many soldiers during that final conflict. Hopper alone took out half a dozen in the Upside Down.
There was a full-scale government operation involved, and yet 18 months later, everyone is happy, graduating, and living their lives completely consequence-free.
Wait, how could we possibly argue they walked away from a mass casualty event without any consequences? The military would never just drop the investigation into their most powerful asset and the complete failure of the operation.
It strains credulity to believe the most powerful government forces would just let it go.
So what's the explanation?
The only logical interpretation that grants the remaining characters their freedom is that the belief that 11 died, the ultimate asset, the ultimate threat, was the price for the gang's freedom.
So if Dr. K and the military believed 11 had made the ultimate sacrifice and the immediate threat, the girl with the powers, was neutralized,
they would have less reason to pursue the remaining crew. They could write it off as a classified incident, allowing the Hawkins curse to supposedly lift, and the characters to be released without consequence.
This outcome strongly lends credence to the 11 died theory as the necessary sacrifice for the community's safety.
Now, if Elle had truly survived via illusion and gone into hiding, Dr. K is not stupid. She knows about Kali's existence and her power to cast illusions.
Ain't quite.
She might release the group specifically to track them, knowing they would eventually lead her back to 11. And this fear of being hunted explains why Elle would need to stay isolated, permanently perpetuating the cycle of trauma, even if she is alive.
That brings us back to the crucial distinction we needed to make earlier. Kali's power and the consistency issues, which directly impact the plausibility of Theory 1.
Right. Kali's power allows for illusions of false things, things that aren't tied to memory. This is fundamentally different from Vecna's method.
Correct. Vecna's illusions, conversely, are almost always tied to a person's traumatic memories. This distinction is crucial for understanding who could have executed the final trickery.
So if Elle's connection with Mike was real, it's Elle. If it was a constructive lie, it's Kali.
But the sources highlight one crucial inconsistency. There's that time when Vecna tricked Hopper into hallucinating killing 11.
Right.
That's a power more like Kali's, creating a false, non-memory-based scenario designed to inflict maximum emotional pain.
And this just muddles the established rules of illusion. If Vecna can project a false event to trick someone, the door is open for multiple characters to be responsible for the final gate illusion.
It suggests the writers weren't entirely rigorous about power consistency throughout the series.
Which makes it even harder to definitively determine who was responsible for the finale's final trickery. Was it Kali, Elle, or even Vecna himself playing some kind of posthumous mind game?
And if we revisit the Kali illusion argument with this lens, to successfully camouflage Eleven's disappearance from the military van, that scene where Dr. K asks where she is, and a soldier confirms she was here a second ago, Kali would have had to be perfectly lucid, possibly far away from the initial explosion, and capable of a pinpoint illusion at the exact moment Elle vanished.
Given the lack of power consistency, isn't that demanding too much magic, even for this universe?
It absolutely strains credibility. The Mike narrative, which relies only on his coping mechanism and the symbolic closing of a chapter, seems far more narratively efficient and thematically powerful, even if it's tragic.
It forces us to confront that central question of narrative purpose versus emotional impact.
And let's not forget the critique related to the final villain himself. Multiple sources found Vecna underwhelming as a final threat.
He was, yeah. Despite controlling the Mind Flayer, he didn't achieve major victories and was ultimately killed pretty easily by Joyce with an axe after being softened up.
The battle felt too safe. The fact that the Demogorgons and Demodogs were completely absent in the abyss, presumably absorbed into the Mind Flayer mass, only made the final battle feel less climactic.
I mean, if the Mind Flayer and Vecna were truly the apex threats, they should have had an army protecting them, or posed a greater physical threat than being susceptible to normal gunfire and spears.
This lack of ultimate risk further fuels the theory that the creators played it safe, making the safe ending Mike's belief in her survival the most palatable choice for the audience, even if it's fictional and rooted in grief.
They gave us heroism because they failed to deliver a truly terrifying final battle.
It truly is a conflict between the magic of the show's 80s influence, where heroes live and miracles happen, and the modern gritty realism the show increasingly flirted with, where sacrifices have irreversible consequences.
So we've meticulously analyzed the logistics and the emotional architecture of both theories. We have two powerful competing narratives.
The Illusion Gambit provides a narrative loophole for a true happy ending. It relies heavily on Kali's timely, though highly improbable, intervention, and it points to practical production choices like the expense of Iceland filming and the absence of the Nosebleed.
It is the story of a triumphant, heroic escape.
The writer's coping mechanism theory, on the other hand, suggests a tragic but poignant closure. It's supported by the D&D symbolism, Mike's own framing of the story, the subtle but powerful Waterfall Discrepancy, and the thematic cost of the gang's freedom.
Which required Eleven's permanent isolation or actual death. It is the story of necessary, painful growth.
The core conflict the episode forces us to confront remains: can this chosen family truly survive the immense trauma they endured without the most powerful among them bearing the ultimate solitary burden?
The fact that the story ends with Mike and Elle separated, regardless of whether she's dead or alive, already feels like a thematic betrayal of the community they spent years building.
It does. If 11 is alive, hidden away in Iceland, doesn't that fundamentally betray the show's core theme that trauma is survived through community?
It feels like it. She is choosing isolation over the very family she fought so hard to find, suggesting she learned the wrong lesson.
And if she is dead, and Mike is simply writing the happy ending he needs to survive, we are left with a different, equally powerful question.
What is the true cost of choosing to only write the happy ending?
Exactly. Is the true sequel for him finding out the crushing truth, or simply accepting the comforting lie he has created to find peace?
Because in the end, whether she's alive or dead, the knowledge Mike carries that he may have lost her forever is the real challenge he has to overcome.
Welcome to The Debate. Today we are grappling with the final, defining moments of the Stranger Things saga. That ending was intentionally frustrating for some, deeply moving for others, and it forces us to confront the central question of the entire series. Does the specific narrative and technical evidence from the finale definitively establish Eleven's physical survival and freedom, or is her fate intentionally ambiguous, functioning primarily as a symbolic or psychological device for the characters she left behind?
And that ambiguity is really the hinge point, isn't it? I'm going to argue that the show's own established physics and the structural framing, the fact that the epilogue is filtered so heavily through Mike's emotional state, strongly suggests that Eleven's definitive survival is only guaranteed if we accept some significant, maybe even intentional narrative inconsistencies, or if we just interpret that final scene as Mike's necessary, hopeful fiction.
I see why you prioritize the thematic reading, I do, but I contend that the technical clues, and frankly the sheer effort the creators put into the final visuals, that constitutes powerful objective evidence. When you follow the breadcrumbs, Callie's prophecy, the production investment, the very specific physical location, they all point strongly toward a planned and successful physical survival. So yes, I'm advocating that Elle is definitively alive and free.
And I'm coming at it from a different angle. If we assume the rules of the world hold true, then the only way Elle survives that finale is by breaking those rules. Therefore, I argue the ambiguity is the true ending. Her survival is subjective, a necessary narrative tool for the surviving group to achieve closure, or, if we're being a bit harsh, a form of narrative copium.
Okay, so let's look at the concrete evidence supporting a definitive survival. Starting with the complex narrative choreography that had to happen to secure her freedom. First, we have to recognize Callie, number 8, not just as a returning character, but as a dedicated narrative shield and strategic guide. Her final, very poignant dialogue stating that her story ends in the Upside Down, but Elle's does not, that serves as a clear prophecy. It's a signal that she has established some kind of escape route or protection for Eleven. This isn't just sentimental dialogue, it's a narrative promise.
That's a compelling reading, but have you really considered the logistics of that promise? I mean, Callie was severely injured, she was shot, she was bleeding out, and just moments later, the Upside Down, which was the literal source of her power, was vaporized in a massive exotic matter explosion. The idea that she could execute a perfectly timed pinpoint illusion to shield Elle, or make her invisible, or fake her death, all while in that state, it just stretches credibility way past its breaking point. If that illusion was dependent on her concentration, on her life force, which was obviously compromised, the whole thing should have just dissolved instantly, leaving Elle completely exposed at the moment of the blast.
I want to pivot on your point about cost and reality, though. Beyond Kaylee's setup, just consider the production choices. The showrunners spent millions flying crews to Iceland to film Eleven's final waterfall scene. They chose a highly specific, real-world location, Hafos, a stunning but incredibly costly backdrop. Why would you invest that amount of production value in a location that only features 2 specific waterfalls? And we will come back to that detail. If the entire sequence was just an abstract internal vision inside Mike's head, or some vague, wishful memory, they could have shot that on a green screen in a Vancouver studio for a fraction of the cost. The physical, grounded reality of that location, it argues for objective truth. We are seeing Elle in a real place, not a fantasy.
The problem with that objective truth theory, though, is that it requires us to just ignore the established physics of Elle's powers. Let's talk about the military's kryptonite sonic blockers. They were activated to suppress all psionic energy around the gate. These things were specifically designed to inhibit Elle's telekinesis and her telepathy, and yet, immediately after this, she's able to project into Mike's mind for a final, calm, coherent communication with Purple Rain playing as an emotional anchor. And critically, and this is the big one, there is the absence of the nosebleed.
But the absence of the nosebleed is intentional. That's the proof of her success. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The nosebleed is not a stylistic choice. It's the visual manifestation of extreme psychokinetic strain. It's the physical cost exacted when Elle forces a breach in reality. Throughout the entire series, whether she's opening a gate, fighting a demogorgon, or just projecting over a short distance, that strain has been a consistent rule. For her to perform one of the most powerful feats of telepathy in the series, entering Mike's subconscious across time and space, with perfect composure and zero physical consequence, it means one of two things. Either the showrunners just forgot the most iconic physical detail of their main character because of rushed writing, or this scene is not happening in objective reality. And the latter supports my argument that this is either a flawless final illusion by Callie, again, highly implausible, or it's simply Mike's fictionalized processing of her loss.
We have to assume, for the sake of narrative integrity, that they did not just forget the nosebleed. I argue the lack of strain is evidence of a power progression, achieved specifically because of Kali's final sacrificial intervention. Kali's power is illusion, it's mental redirection. When Elle escapes, she is operating from a position of safety. She's no longer under duress from the sonic blockers because she used Kali's powers to move herself outside their effective range and into a hidden, secure location. So the calm, bloodless projection isn't an inconsistency. It's a statement that she has achieved a new level of control, maybe absorbing some of Kali's technique, that lets her communicate without that typical physical toll.
But the timing is still the issue. If Kali's illusion was running at the same time the exotic matter explosion was happening, the physics just don't line up. And you have to account for the military element, too. They had Elle's location pinpointed. If she was just hiding nearby, the military would have swept the entire area immediately after the blast, assuming they survived. This definitive survival theory, it requires a level of coordinated, flawless execution that feels more like a fantasy epilogue than a grounded narrative development. And speaking of fantasy, let's talk about Mike's narrative control. You argued that the 2 waterfalls versus his initial fantasy of 3 proves the scene is objective reality. I want to challenge that. Mike's whole arc in the epilogue is about coping. We literally see him putting away his D&D books and starting to write his own book. He's turning real-world, traumatic events into fiction as a form of therapy.
They would have validated his childhood fantasy to give him perfect closure. Instead, they inserted a visual flaw, a subtle correction, to tell the audience, this location is real. It exists outside of Mike's fictionalized perfection. The Icelandic setting, with its specific, verifiable geography, exists independently of Mike's wish fulfillment. It proves Elle is physically there.
I just think you're misinterpreting the function of that discrepancy. The shift from 3 to 2 waterfalls is Mike internalizing and normalizing his trauma. His initial fantasy was boundless, pure escapism. His final narrative, the story he writes, is anchored in a more mature, if slightly diminished reality. The 2 waterfalls symbolize the imperfect safe haven that Elle could actually obtain, but the entire scene is still viewed through Mike's emotional lens. His emotional distress earlier in the season, the panic attacks triggered by those sonic frequencies, suggest he hasn't achieved closure on his own terms. He needs this final, happy narrative ending to move forward, which makes the scene a successful narrative conclusion for Mike, regardless of Elle's literal fate.
But if the narrative is strictly about Mike finding closure, then the show has severely cheapened Elle's agency. Her entire story is about choosing her own destiny and escaping her traumatic history. If her freedom is just a metaphor for Mike's emotional recovery, it diminishes the stakes of her physical sacrifice at the gate. The expensive Iceland location, the absent nosebleed, Kali's prophecy, these are all clues designed to validate her physical achievement of freedom, not just Mike's internal acceptance of loss.
This brings us squarely to our final and perhaps most crucial point, the military context. If Elle is definitively alive and free, the ending introduces massive, irreconcilable plot holes regarding the U.S. government. She is, once again, a fugitive, implicated in the mass destruction of a black site and the deaths of numerous military personnel.
But they believe she was dead.
Exactly. And that belief is precisely why the ending feels so narratively clean. But let's zoom out. This was not a small incident. This was a high-level operation involving Dr. K's faction, a powerful organization committed to weaponizing psionic energy. The entire lab, the core evidence, and dozens of personnel were vaporized. For the surviving government entities to just say, well, the lab blew up, so let's just forget the entire multi-year, multi-million-dollar program and the deaths of our men, is wildly inconsistent with their previous operations. The 18-month peaceful closure, where all the teens graduate without fear of pursuit, only works because her death was narratively required to close that massive government plot thread.
I disagree fundamentally. The military's withdrawal is entirely logical when you consider plausible deniability, especially with illegal black site operations. The exotic matter explosion, while tragic for them, actually served the government's highest political interests. The destruction of the lab eliminates the key asset, L, and all physical evidence of the Upside Down and the illegal experiments. Pursuing the surviving teenagers would risk exposing their own criminal activities.
But Dr. K's faction is still out there. Their motivation wasn't just to study the Upside Down, it was to control L. If they suspect, even for a moment, that she survived, the hunt resumes. The complete and sudden end of that pursuit for 18 months, it just suggests they concluded definitively that she was gone.
But that conclusion secured by Callie's illusion. Elle's death was the required sacrifice, not of her life, but of her visible identity. She traded visibility for freedom. The military by design assumes failure means elimination. They cut their losses and bury the evidence. Her survival doesn't create a plot hole. It resolves the political tension. The military wins by eliminating the liability, and Elle wins by gaining freedom through invisibility. The happy ending is achieved because Elle pays the price of permanent anonymity.
But that invisibility still requires a level of vigilance and power control that is incredibly taxing. We are led to believe she's just relaxing near a waterfall, free and at peace. That level of relaxation just feels antithetical to the life of a high-profile fugitive. The show, I think, sacrifices the consistency of its political world building for the sake of emotional closure.
And I contend that the technical clues, the real-world filming, the precise geographical grounding, are the creator's attempt to anchor that closure in a reality that transcends Mike's emotional interpretation, providing Elle with the agency and freedom she fought for across 5 seasons. In conclusion, while the finale brilliantly employed ambiguity to reflect Mike's process of healing, the specific, costly, and detailed evidence provided to the audience strongly points toward Eleven's physical survival. Callie's explicit prophecy, the visual correction of the fantasy, 2 waterfalls not 3, and the deliberate evolution of her powers all serve as narrative affirmations that she achieved a safe, real-world freedom.
Ultimately, the issue is which narrative thread we prioritize. The emotional closure for the group, or the established physics of the world. The fact that definitive survival requires us to overlook, glaring violations of fundamental rules, the nosebleed, the feasibility of Callie's illusion, the political impossibility of the military's withdrawal, suggests that the primary function of the epilogue is subjective healing. The viewer is given hope, but the survival itself is framed through Mike's coping narrative, reinforcing the theme that belief can triumph over the harsher realities of trauma and loss.
And in that tension, I think the creators successfully prompted a really intense reflection on the nature of truth, closure, and narrative interpretation, ensuring this debate will continue long after the credits have rolled.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell to the later update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end, and see you in the next video.